Hey there folks! Today I'm going to start talking about remote functions in SvelteKit. More specifically, I'm going to talk about queries in this video. In the next one, I'm going to talk about how to make changes using remote functions, but today it's all about queries. And I'm going to do that by continuing with the app that we have been building throughout this series, which is the travel journal app. I'm going to be refactoring some of the code that we have from the previous implementation. So I highly recommend that you watch that one, specifically the one about loading data with SvelteKit, because I'm not going to go over everything that happened so far. Having said that, let's start talking about remote functions. Remote functions, first of all, are an experimental feature of SvelteKit. So they could still have bugs, they could have breaking changes. I personally have been using them and I have been enjoying because they simplify the code by a mile. Having said that, remember, it is still experimental. What are remote functions? Remote functions are a way to communicate between the client and the server in a type-safe way. That translates to us calling functions from either the server or the client, and those functions are remote, meaning that they always run on the server side. They are safe enough to call server-only modules, and the way we call those functions is just like any other functions that we may call in JavaScript. Now, they do need to be defined in a special module called .remote.ts or JS if you're using JavaScript. But other than that, they look like any other function in your SvelteKit project. But we need to first enable them. So those two flags here, experimental remote functions and experimental async, are required in order to enable remote functions. Enough theory, let's go and start refactoring some of this code. I'm going to start on this layout.server.ts that loads all the trips for the layout. So in the layout here, we have all these trips displayed in the left side. We're going to replace this with a remote function. First, I'm going to create a new file called trips.remote.ts. As I said, this is a requirement being called .remote.ts. Then I'm going to paste in some code in here. So to define a query, a remote query, we need to import query from app.server. That's what tells SvelteKit that this is a remote function. But then other than that, this behaves like any other code that we have. Get all trips here is just calling the database and retrieving the trips. I'm logging this in the console, and I'm going to explain this in a second. And query takes a callback function. So that's what we're defining here. Now let's go back to our code and use this getTrips function here. I'm going to come to the layout.svelte in here, and instead of getting the data from the load function, I'm going to remove this from the props, and I am going to remove this line too. So await, I need this, await, and I'm going to get trips from remote. Then I'm going to have trips in here, and I'm going to close this down on the bottom, and that should be enough. If I load the page in here, we're going to see that we still see the data. I can even come here and delete this file because it only has this load function. So I'm going to delete it, reload once again, and again, we still see the data. Now, let's go over this code a little bit. I need to import getTrips from my trips.remote file here, and await, this works with any promises. So the await keyword here works with any promises. Any remote query returns a promise. That's why we can use it with await. And then we're defining a variable here to hold the trips. That's pretty much it. There's no specific syntax to call a remote query function. I did, though, introduce an issue by removing that layout server.ts file. If I come here to this other page, the page that is displaying an actual trip, we are expecting to have trips coming from the load function, and we don't anymore. So let's start fixing this here. This piece of code here needs data.trips, and data.trips is only being used for the trip navigation. At the bottom of the page, I have a previous trip and a next trip. That's what this code is being used for. There's a footer here that we're using for that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come here, cut this off, add a new component called trip footer.svelte, paste that in. Of course, we're going to have some errors. And I'm gonna start fixing those by copying and paste the code that exists in the page. So let's add a script tag and remove all of this here. Actually cut, not remove, and paste in here. Okay, we solved some of the problems, we have other ones. First, we need the trips. So how do we get that? We can call our function, our remote function. So let's do that. Once I have the trips in here, I can remove the data dot, and that should be it. If I go back to the page, I'm gonna come back and explain this in a second, but I'm gonna go back to the bottom of the page here, and I'm gonna call this component. So trip footer. And I believe, yes, there's one more thing here. We need the trip ID. So let's get the trip ID from the props. And in here, I'm gonna change this to use that. Go back to the page. And now we need to pass the trip ID. I'm just gonna validate that this exists. Okay, so if I did everything correct and I come to the application and I try to see the trips, I can see the footer here where I can navigate to the next trip, and this is working. Now, one thing you may have noticed is that I'm calling get trips from here, and I'm also calling get trips from the layout page here. And you might think, okay, we're gonna have multiple requests for this, which is not the case. And I'm gonna show this by leveraging that console.log we have in the remote file here. So we have this console.log, and for every single call to this, we should be logging this information. I'm gonna go back to the page, I'm gonna reload it, and we can see that only once this has been logged. And if I navigate to different pages, you can see that only once this has been logged. So what's happening here is that SvelteKit automatically caches the remote function based on the arguments being sent to the remote function, which means that if you have several components within this page here that need that data, they can all call the remote function, and only one request is going to be triggered to this function here, which is pretty neat. We don't need to do much about it. We just need to call it, and if there are no arguments or the arguments don't change, it's just one single request. Just know that this can be called multiple times within the page, and it's going to be cached. Now let's move on with our refactoring here. We created this trip footer component. We're gonna now create another one, which is for the photos. So I'm gonna add a trip photos.svelte. And this part here is what I'm going to refactor now. I'm gonna come here and find the photo section, which is this one. Cut this, save here, and move to the photos. Now it is expecting some photos, and we don't have that remote function yet. So let's create the remote function. Come here, paste some more code, import this. We have the error on the V here, and this is just because I need to import the value-bot. I'll talk about what that is in just a minute, but first let's see this working. Go back here, and we're gonna say that we're gonna get photos or get trip photos. Once again, importing from the remote file. The trip photos needs the trip ID. So let's get it from the props and pass it down. Trip ID. I need to say that this script is of type TypeScript. Now on the page, I just need to call that component. Let's go down here and add one just before the footer and pass the ID. Okay, let's see if this is working. We should be seeing the photos at the bottom right before the footer. So we do see it here. If I navigate to Kyoto, where we have 3 photos, there you go, it's loading. So very similar to how we did for the footer. The main difference here is that we are once again relying on the await keyword, just because I don't need to manipulate the data returned from this remote function. In the footer, we needed to calculate the previous and next trips. But there's one thing that I want to display in here, which is we're now requiring an argument for this remote function. But the way we do this, and we know that this is a string, is by defining a schema validator. I'm using validBot here ValueBot is used throughout SvelteKit's documentation. I have never used ValueBot before, but I thought that while doing this demo, why not learn something different? You could use Zod if you're used to that. That's what I normally use. But just to reiterate, the one thing that we need to do is define a schema validator here. And in this case, we're saying that trip ID is of type string. When we call the photos, the remote function for photos, we do need to pass the argument like we do for any other functions. And this is working fine. Now, before I continue, I want to surface another benefit of remote functions. In this component, the trip photos and the trip footer, we are requiring or requesting the data within the component itself. If we follow the standard way of fetching data in SvelteKit, what we normally do is we have a load function that loads the data, pass to the page, and the page then needs to pass that down to any components. And if we had several components, we would have to pass that down to those components as well. Now in here, we don't need to follow all that path. Each component can just request the data that it actually needs to execute, and the page itself doesn't need to pass that down or follow that flow of passing down the data. So that's also something that I think is a benefit. It makes for the page to be a little bit more clean. Now let's do the final refactor here, and this is the biggest one of all. We're gonna move the trip entries, and I'm gonna come here and take this section, cut, paste into the trip entries, and once again we're gonna have several errors in here. What I will be doing is I'm gonna come here to the page and I'm gonna copy all of this script tag here, and I'm gonna paste in the component. We're not gonna need everything from here, but it's gonna be easier this way. So let's remove the things that we don't need. And I know now that the data for this component is not gonna come from the data from the props. We're gonna get that from the remote functions. So I'm gonna remove this. This is going to generate a few more errors. So in order to solve those, let's first create a remote function to get the entries. Coming here to my remote file, and just like before, we're defining a schema that tells what are the arguments that this function needs to execute. In this case, we need an object that has a trip ID and the page because the entries are paginated. So that's how we're handling that. Then I'm gonna call the database and pass down the page. And that's pretty much it. So I'm gonna come here and create another const, and I'm gonna call this entries result. And once again, I'm gonna need the trip ID, okay? I'm gonna get that from the props. And of course, this is an object that needs the page. And in order to use this, I'm gonna have to move this code to the top before I'm getting the entries so that I can pass the current, and this just needs to be a string. All right, this, just want to review this here. This component is a little bit more complex because one, I'm manipulating the pages for the entries. Also because I'm trying to optimistically update the UI. We're handling all that in memory here. That's why there's a lot of code for this component and it becomes a little bit more cumbersome. But let's now continue. So each place that we're using data, we're now gonna update this. First, I'm gonna start this component here with an empty array, and I'm gonna say that this is coming from entries result.entries, and I need to define a type for this entries here, which is a type of entries results.entries. Now I need to look for the other places to update this. We also need to get the trip. So let's go and do that. Once again, there's nothing special about this getTrip function here. We just need to request it by passing the trip ID, and it's going to return a single trip. Coming here now, I just need to request this trip ID. So I'm gonna do this by getting the trip remote function. And now I can say that instead of getting this from data.trip, it's just trip. This is now type of entries result entries. I can remove this one. Same thing here. Entries result dot entries. And finally down here, I don't need the trip. Okay. All errors have been fixed. the page where we're calling this, we now need to call trip entries. We're gonna have to pass the trip ID, and we need to pass in the form that the component is expecting right here. Why we're still passing the form? Because I'm not yet refactoring the form part or the form changes using remote functions. We're going to do that in the next video. So that's why we still need to grab the form from the props in the page and then pass this down to the component. And that's pretty much it. There is a bunch of code now that I can just delete from here. I think all I need is the form. All I need is the form, not the data. So one more thing here is that in the page, we also need the trip data. So let's go and come here, copy this line and paste it in here and say that we're not getting this from the data anymore, but rather from the trip variable. And this is going to be page.params.id. We have an issue because in here it can be undefined. Okay, fine. Let's go and grab the params from the props and use from the props. And then just for consistency, let's update in here as well. Now we don't need any of these imports anymore. And again, if I did everything correctly, this should be working now. Let me reload this. Okay, we have the entries in here. I can navigate to the next. You saw this changing. If I go to a different page, we have the entries from that place. So we're in Lisbon, Portugal. I can add a new entry here. So test, and save the entry. It's in there. If I reload the page, we can see that it's in there. I can delete it. So everything is working. Once again, the principle remains the same, right? We're now getting the data for this component from within the component. So we're calling getTrip in here, we're calling getTrip entries in here, and getting the data from the remote functions. This is just more complex because of how the component is by handling pagination and optimistic UI and all of that. But other than that, it's the same, which also means that this page here is now way simpler. It's simpler and could have been simpler, granted, by having components before, but we would still have to get the data from the load function. Now we don't need that. I can even come here and delete this function from here, and the page will still work. So I don't have the load function anymore. I don't need that. I can just call the remote queries. The next one I want to talk about is here on this page in all trips here. I'm going to change this page to return more information. I'm going to paste in some code in here. Right now we just have the H1. There is a lot of code in here. Most of it is just markup, and I'm going to go over that in a second. But there are a couple of errors here. We're expecting to have two new functions in the remote file, the get paginated trips and the get trip stats. So let's create those first, and then I'll explain what's happening here. Get paginated trips is very similar to get entries. We are still expecting an object. We have a page size that by default is 6, and a page size, I should say, is this one here, which by default is 6, and the current page, just like we were getting this from get trip entries. And then we're calling a get paginated trips from DB, which I need to import. Get paginated trips as get paginated trips from DB. There you go. All this is doing is, once again, taking the page size, taking the current page, and then I have a function that queries the database for the trips in a paginated form. That's it. This one is a little bit different. I'm going to import this function first, and you can see that we have query.batch, and I'm going to talk about this one in a second. I just want to demo this working first. I'm going to come back to this page. Now we have get paginated trips and get trip stats in here. Let's go over this file first. The first thing that is happening here is that now, instead of getting all the trips like we do in the sidebar here, we're getting the trips paginated 6 by 6, and then we're managing all of that here, but we are iterating over every single trip in the trips that we got. And for every single trip in this each block here, we're calling get trip stats by its trip.id. By looking at this, you would or could assume that we're making multiple requests to get this stats for the trips. And the stats right now, let me just show this quickly, is the number of entry counts and the number of photos that we have for that trip. That's pretty much it, as simple as that. If I come here to this page, you can see that this is being now displayed 6 by 6. I can navigate, go to the next page, and so on. And if we look at the network tab, so let's take a look at this and navigate to 1, you see that there's just one single request to get all the stats for all the trips on that page. If I navigate to 4, again, one more request, and that's pretty much it. Not several requests as one would expect by looking at that each code block. Now, how this is happening? In the remote function, we're defining this as being a batch query. And we define, again, the schema validation, and we're saying it's just a string, which is for the type of trip IDs. But as you can see here, we're actually getting an array of strings, not just a single string, even though I define this as a single string. The batch here is bundling everything together into an array of strings. Then I do have, again, another function that is getting all the data, and it does need to get all the data for an array of strings and conciliate all that. I'm doing that in a map, and then I'm returning that map back. The final part here is that the query.batch function needs to return a callback function that will then get each specific trip ID and get the specific data, the stats in this case, from the lookup data that we have in here, this map function, and return that value. So what SvelteKit is doing behind the scenes in this case is it's batching all the calls to this remote function that has happened in a single event loop of JavaScript. So all of the calls within a single event loop are batched together, and then SvelteKit takes care of sending that in one request, getting back the request response, and then reconciliating that with the callers of this function here, which is pretty neat because that makes for a more performant way of calling the queries here. All right, that's all that I had to talk about queries and query.batch. The other kind of remote function that we have for getting data within SvelteKit is the pre-render, and pre-render works exactly like query does. The one difference is that pre-render is called while we are compiling the application or building the application, and query is called at runtime. I'm not going to demo pre-render here. It works exactly the same way as query. It's just that, as I said, it's called during build time and not at runtime. All right, that's it. I hope that this process of refactoring code is helpful for you to understand how remote functions work with SvelteKit. The next video, I'm going to talk about forms and how to use remote form functions. And we're going to do the same process. We're going to migrate some of this code into using remote functions. Until next time, thanks for watching.